am Jonas Romblad. I used to be pretty much involved into boomerangs up until around year 2000, and I was in particular involved with MTAs and developed carbon fiber or fiber composite MTAs in the, when was that, early 90s, I believe, and so that's who I am. I started throwing, well, my first exposure to boomerangs, I do not know quite when that was. I must have been 12 maybe, 12, 13. I often hang out at the local library and I stumbled onto a book, or almost a little leaflet, I think it was 12, 15 pages or something like that, a book about boomerangs in Swedish. I got this book with me, I built a boomerang and it worked. I had a lot of fun with it, but then that boomerang broke and I built a second boomerang which I thought was just the same, just a copy of the first one, but it was not, and it did not work. So these two boomerangs, the broken one and the one which did not work, they ended up in a box and they stayed in this box for a year or two. I sort of forgot about boomerangs, and at some point I opened this box again and I found these two boomerangs, and then I started getting curious. Why does one work and the other one does not? And then I started making boomerangs and trying to see what makes a boomerang work better or worse, and why did one work and the other one not. And that's when I really got started making boomerangs for real. Well, at that time I was pretty lonely throwing boomerangs in Stockholm. I was not aware of anyone else in Stockholm or Sweden throwing boomerangs. And that meant, in order to get some kind of information, I had gotten in touch with people abroad, in particular in the US. And I was on a semi-regular basis getting the many happy returns of the US Boomerang Association. And this was at a time when MTAs was starting to appear. So I started reading about MTAs and finding rather incomplete building plans for MTAs. And as you know, more than half of the secret of an MTA is actually the tuning, and not just the shape and the airfoils and stuff. So that meant I found MTAs a very interesting concept. I had big difficulties getting anything to fly like what people were describing in the articles. And I tried buying a couple of MTAs, but of course after shipping in a box for several weeks, when they came to me, they had lost their tune and it didn't really help much. So my first exposure to MTAs was actually rather frustrating, but also it really caught my curiosity. And it's also, MTAs for me is a link between boomerangs, which in my view is a lot closer to a physical sport compared to the other, my other hobby passion, which is model aircraft, where the physical part of the sport is much smaller than with boomerangs. And in many of the model airplane categories, competitions for gliders, for instance, are about flying a long time. So there was a very direct link with the MTAs between the model airplane world and the boomerang world. So that for me was, because of this background in both boomerangs and model airplanes, it fit me very, very well. There was actually two different things that fed into this. First of all, you need to remember at what time this was. This was early days. It was before internet. Pretty much my only sources of information about MTAs was 2 or 3 issues of Many Happy Returns. And at that time, the absolute guru of MTAs was Ted Bailey. And from the articles that he was writing, it seemed like if he had been experimenting quite a bit with different shapes. And there was also other people who were commenting on shapes of MTAs and saying that they pretty much need to be this kind of shape, the hockey stick, slightly more open than 90 degrees, longer leading arm, shorter trailing arm. That's kind of what they need to look like. And since I was having enough problems just figuring out tunings and things, I was not really into venturing into weird shapes. So that meant I was experimenting over in Ted Bailey style boomerangs or shapes, because that was my only source of inspiration, only source of information. Yes. So that was one part of it. The specific shape and size of my composite MTAs are to a large extent a copy or semi-copy of a wooden MTA that I have or had, which I made a number of different MTAs, a bit smaller, a bit larger, and there was a couple of them worked sort of well. This one worked better than the others. So I thought, all right, that's a good starting point. So I copied the shape of that one. I tried to copy the tune to some extent. So the dihedral, the amount of dihedral and the dihedral distribution, in the sense of at least between elbow, mid and tip, is fairly close to what that boomerang had at that time. And I think I also tried to copy the twist, I mean, as far as you can, and that's more or less where the shape and so on came from. Having said that, if I take this wooden boomerang and put it in my mold, the dihedral and so on does not quite match. I'm wondering where to start. The reason for me wanting to build fiber composite boomerangs was that as I described, for me the tuning was really a hassle. I had difficulties finding out how tuning worked. For me, the tuning recommendations that I found in articles and so on, some of it worked, some of it did not work at all. And I also found that, as I guess you and all the others, I go to the field, I bring out a wooden MTA, I tune it, everybody is happy, I put it back in my bag. Next week I come out again, I need to start not quite from scratch, but it's not where I left it last time. And that's when I was thinking, if I can somehow make a boomerang that stays in shape, then at least I have eliminated the endless fiddling on tuning and so on, which has pros and cons. And I was already, from my experience in model airplanes, interested in fiber composites. And I knew people who were making model airplanes, model propellers, various bits and pieces for model airplanes out of fiber composites. So I was able to borrow technology from various parts of model airplaning, which meant the sort of research or invention part was actually very small. I was able to look at how people were making propellers for a specific type of model airplane, and the structural build-up of these propellers are very close to the MTAs that I made. Also the materials I was able to get through the sources of model airplane suppliers. So in that sense, getting started in the composites on boomerangs was actually more a matter of applying technology which was not necessarily well known to me. It was also things that I needed to learn and so on, but I did not need to develop things from scratch. and I was definitely able to get a lot of inspiration and help from looking at other people doing not boomerangs, but things that I could use bits and pieces from. Spherical tuning. I mentioned that my composite MTAs were based on a wooden MTA. That is partly true. At the same time as I was reading these articles and trying to experiment with my own tuning and so forth, there was also recommendations about spherical tuning. And I did make one MTA mold before the one that I've used to make the MTAs that I've sold. And that mold was actually spherical tuned. But I only made I think 2 or 3 boomerangs out of that mold because things got stuck in the mold and disaster. The wooden boomerang that I ended up using as a sort of inspiration later on, it's kind of fit as well in this spherical mold, sort of. So one could say that the MTAs that I made were partly, to some extent, inspired by spherical tuning. I think the radius that I used were about, I guess, 3 meters or something like that. I just remember the length of I used a wire and a sand and a grinder to grind a block that would have a spherical shape, and that is what I used to put the MTA on top of. So you could say that there's a little bit of spherical tuning in my composite MTAs, but I think there's actually more of this wooden boomerang shape into them. When I made the mold for this boomerang, it came out and worked, and it worked well, kind of from the beginning. I have not changed anything geometrically in the mold. This is the way it came out from the very first. Correction, I have ground away the whole upper side of the mold and made that one new because I damaged it at one point. But the bottom part with the tune is exactly the same as it was from the very beginning. And I have kind of made the same layup more or less. I've gone to a bit of different techniques to get the thickness down a little bit and a few other little tricks to change stuff a little bit. But I mean, considering the struggles I had with tune of wooden MTAs and then make a mold and have it come out and actually work.
An aluminium master.
Well, the aluminium master was sort of just a way of, I had an idea of I want the dihedral to be this much and so on. So I just made a couple of supports and I bent this aluminium thing to match those. So yeah, but I was extremely lucky. Yes, but the master is an aluminium boomerang. It has never been thrown. I have no intention to try to throw it at any time. It was just a geometry that was easy to get to a nice surface finish, and that I could bend to the shape I wanted, and which would sort of stay in that shape without changing with time or humidity and so on. Having said that, it's not very stiff, so it needs to be supported in order to build up the mold on top of it. Well, the first thought that I get when I see this one is that it's very well preserved. It brings back fun memories, good memories. It is not sure how to label it. I wouldn't really call it a product, but it's a device, a thing that I've had immensely much fun with over the years, and I've met so many people by getting involved in this. So much nice people. So, and that has been really a nice experience. This particular boomerang, I see from the nameplate, was made for Mr. Murata in Japan, and I believe I gave you the story already in the written interviews, the embassy story. So that was a really funny experience with meeting, well, not meeting him at that point, but getting in touch with him and the Japanese boomerang throwers. So I think those are my spontaneous thoughts when I see this one. This is the part of this is a student association at the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. It's a student association for the students studying aeronautics, naval architecture, ground vehicle engineering and systems engineering, if I remember right. They might have changed these things in the last 30 years, but so this was and is the logotype of the student association, which I was part of. And I think the association is still very active. In Sweden, these kind of student associations have a rather long history, and they are typically very strong and active associations at the universities, and they tend to help students with. Well, it's really an association of students working for students. So it's like the club where you study, where you meet your friends, that sort of thing. And at the time I was rather active in this society, and it turned out that they were making stickers that happened to fit very well in my boomerangs, so I thought, well, fits nicely, why not start using them? And that's the story. So there was no deep thoughts really behind it. It's a completely normal sticker. It's not custom made for my boomerangs at all. I just bought the stickers of the student union, and in order to getting into technical details again, when you look at this sticker, you're actually looking through a layer of fiberglass. So there is a thin layer of fiberglass on top of this, otherwise it would probably fall off. And in order to deal with the sticker, which had a sticky back, which can be a real hassle if you put it down in lamination, your carbon fiber sticks to it and everything goes overboard. I used talcum powder or microballoons on the backside to kill the stickiness. So these are regular stickers, standards that I could buy at school. If I remember right, this was this was in the US. The epic flight was done in, was it Delaware, Ohio, I believe, close to where Chet lives. If I remember the story right, we had there had been a large competition somewhere else the weekend before. And somehow people had agreed on meeting up at Chet Snuffer's place, and I don't think there was a competition that weekend, but there was a big handful of boomerang throwers meeting up. And people were out throwing all kinds of boomerangs, just scattered over a big field, having fun. And John had bought one of my MTAs on that weekend before. If I remember right, if someone can correct me, I'd be more than happy to change my story. We're out there throwing, and we are a couple of people throwing MTAs, and all of a sudden John shouts and points upwards and says, "I have a thermal, I'm going to lose my MTA." And people stop throwing. because it was just fascinating to see this MTA sitting there. And it was a fairly calm day, a warm day, a bit like today, warm day, very little clouds, not that much wind. And the boomerang rose fairly high, but still clearly visible. And this field where we were, it's a fairly big one. So it took some time for it to slowly drift like off field. So people had stopped throwing, were looking at this boomerang, and I believe that was it Gary Broadbent who had started a clock, not when John threw, but when he realized that this is going to be a good flight. And the longer the flight went on, the more people like stopped throwing and just sat down in the grass looking at the boomerang and wondering how this is going to end.
You know, in 1993 in Delaware, Ohio, John Gorski threw the 17-minute 6-second MTA flight. Of course, it was my tournament, so I was there. This was at Mingo Park in Delaware, Ohio. Now, the boomerang went up and caught a thermal right away and started rising up. And my immediate thought was, oh no, we're going to lose that boomerang, because Mingo Park is notorious for building great thermals, and a lot of boomerangs over the years have left that park, never to be found again. So we started following the boomerang, heading north across the field. And I was concerned it was going to take off, so I was telling some friends to jump in their cars and get ready to head north on the highway to try to follow the boomerang. But as we chased it, it came to the river, the Olentangy River, and I started to wade across with several people, but it stopped. It stopped right there at that barrier of the river and began to drift back to the south. So we now came out of the river and followed it back toward, there was a kids' soccer game going on. And because this was the day after the tournament, so we didn't have the whole field to ourselves today. It was a practice. We were just having fun. It wasn't the actual tournament. And the boomerang initially went north through the soccer tournament, and we interrupted them and said, hey, look out, we're chasing a boomerang. So now, 15 minutes later, the boomerang is coming back. And we had to tell the soccer kids, look out, the boomerang is coming down. And sure enough, the boomerang came right down on that soccer pitch. So it maybe only traveled 100 yards or so to the north, and then 100 yards or so back to the south. Didn't go real far, but it was very high, still visible, but very high. When it came down, John caught it on the field. We immediately ran over and took the American flag off of the flagpole and wrapped it around his shoulders and took pictures. And part of us wanted to throw our own boomerang and try to catch that magic. But then we thought, you know what? That's the magic A is gone. B, no other boomerang should be thrown on this field today. And so sure enough, we stopped. Everyone agreed we should not throw any more boomerangs on this field. Like nothing could surpass what we have just seen with our own eyes. And so we packed up all of our bags and we left, and no one threw another boomerang. It was very cool to be there.
The weird thing was that the boomerang drifted away in the thermal at sort of the same height. It climbed a bit and then sort of settled, and very, very slowly started drifting off the field. It got to a row of trees, and at this point it was like 2-3 times the height of the trees, so it's not nearly, it was not getting into the trees at all. It was more a question, can John follow it through the trees, and where is he going to find it at all? To everybody's surprise, it then stops and starts drifting back again onto the field. And everybody was, of course, absolutely astonished to see this thing coming back into the field again. And John just walks back into the field and boomerang comes down and he catches it. And that was the end of the throwing of the day, as far as I remember, because everybody was just fascinated by the long flight. And
end of the day.
Yes. To some extent, yes. I mean, there's certain aspects of boomerang throwing that I miss. It has not been enough for me to get back into boomerang throwing again. I think one of the main reasons being, or there being two main reasons. One being, I would be in the same position again. I would be the only one throwing where I'm at, and that's one of the reasons why I got out of boomerangs. And having said that, there's also another aspect of it. What I think for me would be interesting to pursue in boomerangs would be things like MTAs and fiber composite things and stuff like that. And I would really like to have someone to have a dialogue about this. So it means even if I would find someone in the neighborhood that would be throwing boomerangs but who might be into accuracy, it might not be that much of an inspiration. So I think that's that is a bit what I would be missing if I would be trying to get into boomerangs again. But there's definitely fun things about boomerang throwing. I have left boomerang throwing. I have done it in a rather clear way, but I have definitely no hard feelings or anything like that. So boomerang throwing has a big part in my heart still, even if I've not been throwing boomerangs almost at all for 20 years. I'm flattered by getting the question. As we have already been discussing quite a bit before, I had sort of a dream when I was in the last years of making boomerangs, and I think that was for a long time a bit of a holy grail of practical competition MTA throwing, and that is, you all know the scenario. It's a bit of a windy day. You are doing MTA, MTA 100 or unlimited, and the process of throwing and catching goes something like this. You walk up to the line as far upwind as you can, you throw your boomerang as hard as you can, and you do not even look at it. You turn around 180 degrees, you run for 20 seconds, then you stop, turn around and start searching for the boomerang. This is the only way you can get fast enough downwind. And then you just hope that you are not falling out of the 100-meter circle. And I always found this very suboptimal in wind conditions, because we have these boomerangs which travel quite far out and then they travel all the way back again, and that's where they start to hover and start drifting downwind. So I had this vision of a boomerang that flies, not seen from the top, not like a teardrop or a circle, but it flies like a figure of 9 and starts to hover somewhere upwind. And then you can start drifting back again into the circle where you have thrown it. That's something I was trying to achieve a little bit without any success. Apart from other boomerangs. I mean, I have Aussie round boomerangs that do this figure of 9, so somehow it should be possible to do. That is something which I believe should be possible. What I understand from today, this figure of 9 flight pattern of an MTA is at least still not a standard thing that people do. So I could imagine that if that can be achieved somehow, I could imagine that could change MTA throwing in windy conditions quite a bit. That is a very good question. I believe it is, I think it has an influence. I think the influence varies along the blade. For instance, I believe that the shape of the edges close to the elbow is not that important, and the closer you get to the tip is more important. Having said that, we get into again one of these very contradicting experiences that I had compared to what I was reading from people in the early days. In the early days, it was like a known fact that the leading edge of an MTA had to be sharp. The bottom of the boomerang should just continue straight ahead, and the top should come down 45 degrees or something like that. However, my composite MTAs do not look like that. They have a little bit of a rounded edge, and I cannot really say that in wooden MTAs that I personally have seen an advantage in the sharp leading edges. But I think that if the tip region is somehow non-smooth, that is probably a bad idea. The more I learn about aerodynamics, the more, maybe I should say, puzzled I get with what is actually happening aerodynamically around an MTA, both during the throw and climb phase, but as well as in the descent phase. And this means I could imagine, but I have absolutely no proof for it, but I could imagine that the leading edge shape along the arms of the boomerang, an optimum shape might be different depending on where you are. I think that an MTA in hover has a nice attached flow from the leading edge to the trailing edge, close to the tip. When you get, if this is the elbow and we have a center of rotation somewhere here, when you are close to the center of rotation here, I have the impression that this is probably a region where the flow does not stay attached from leading to trailing edge. And if that's the case, it might actually be a separated stalled region, and there might be a region between those where because of the how do I explain this without pen and paper? If you look at the center of rotation of an MTA, and you look at the arms actually have sort of a sweep. So the leading edge is not perpendicular to the flow, which is, and the combination of high angles of attack, which you get close to the center of rotation where the boomerang is coming down, is also coinciding with a region where there's quite a bit of sweep. And this combination of a swept leading edge and a high angle of attack with separation, that typically generates a vortex along the leading edge, which tends to separate from the leading edge and to go a bit on a diagonal across. And if we assume that this vortex is a good thing, which is not necessarily true, I'm not sure. If we want the vortex there, then it is probably beneficial to have a sharp leading edge in that region. Maybe. While further out toward the tip, where the flow looks completely different, I think, there the leading edge, having a little bit more of a rounded leading edge, might be beneficial. These are complete guesses, and there's a lot of different factors that play into this that makes it, from an aerodynamic point of view, both horribly complex and very interesting. There's, I don't know how much to go into details, but boomerangs combine several different complexities at the same time. We have rotation, which is difficult in itself. We also have this thing of swept wings. We have a variation of angle of attack, which is pretty large. I'm pretty sure that region close to the center of gravity, center of rotation, is separated, and close to the tip is not separated. So we have some kind of transition region in between those, and that adds at least one, if not two, additional physical phenomena which are difficult to deal with from a simulation point of view or prediction point of view. And we also deal with very small wings and low speeds, which means that there's yet another physical phenomena which comes into play, laminar separation bubbles. And just one of these things is usually enough to make people say, gee, this is a tricky situation. And in boomerangs we have all four of them. And now we're only talking about the hover. If we then add the outward flying, then we have the combination of the blade that moves forward. As it moves forward, it has a high velocity, and as it goes down again, it has a very low velocity, or maybe even reversed velocity. And that again, and it goes quick. And that means all these weird phenomena, okay, when the boomerang is going out, it's probably not separated in the middle and so on. But you add an unsteadiness, you have a continuous acceleration and deceleration of the flow, which again adds difficulty to figuring out what is actually going on. A little anecdote, I actually talked to my boss and supervisor at Stuttgart University, Werner Würz, about boomerang airfoils a couple of months ago. And we talked about airfoils that would have properties that might help making this figure of 9 flight. And I asked my supervisor if I wanted an airfoil that would do this kind of weird behavior, what kind of features, geometric features, might be able to do this. And he came up with an idea that was not very complex, an undercut on the trailing edge. And I thought about it until the next day, and then I had to ask him, this undercut at the trailing edge, does it really change the lift coefficient curve in the way that I described, or isn't it the other way around? And then he thought a little bit, and he said, well, it can actually be both. And it depends on the Reynolds number, which is a combination of the size of the wing and the velocity of the wing. So depending on how big the boomerangs are and how fast they go, this particular feature can actually do either exactly what we're looking for or the opposite. So just to give an idea of how complex this thing might be. And we've still not started talking about unsteady things, which might again change stuff. So it's I'm not sure which question I started answering here, but boomerang aerodynamics, I think, are very complex, and the guesses I've made about the leading edge shape here, they are just guesses. I could be completely wrong. Thickness is... Sorry, I'm slow at answering because this is is actually a very tricky question to answer. Okay. Because it depends a lot on what kind of airfoil we're talking about. And if we talk about boomerangs, we are, as I mentioned in the question about the leading edges, we are in a situation where I think at least we have an extremely complex flow situation. And I find it actually tricky to give a straight answer what thickness does. If we simplify things, if we look at only the outer part of the boomerang, the tip part, I'm not sure how much of the tip part we're talking about, but let's say the outer 7, 8, maybe 10 centimeters of the leading edge or something. There we have a type of flow where we have there's attached flow around the boomerang, and we do not have an excessive amount of sweep. In this case, drag tends to be linked to thickness, in the sense that, in very general terms speaking, if you increase thickness, your drag tends to go up. And there's also another thing that makes things...
increased lift as well?
Not necessarily. You could look at the airfoil as built up out of... You could split it in the geometry into two different parts if you want to. This is a way that was very popular to look at airfoils in the 1930s, 40s. And to some extent it actually works rather well to understand the basic properties of different airfoil shapes. You can look at the airfoil as a symmetric airfoil, where the top and bottom are the same, and it has some kind of thick distribution of thickness. And then you take this symmetric airfoil and you bend it. So if you make up an airfoil out of a thickness distribution and a bend distribution, it's called camber. So it's a camber distribution. So if you combine these two, you can make any kind of airfoil shape really. So if you change the thickness distribution but not the camber, that means your thickness goes up on top and it goes up also on the bottom, then you do not in theory change the lift characteristics, assuming that you still are able to maintain attached flow at the angles of attack that you're seeing, and so on. So it's a simplification, but it's at least a first step. And when we're talking about our low Reynolds number airfoils, meaning we are down in the flow regime of model airplanes, of birds, and so on, this is where boomerangs tend to operate. It's not like full-size commercial transport airplanes. Then thickness can be a problem. So making an excessively thick airfoil is inviting problems with flow separation and drag, in particular for our small and slow wings in boomerangs. Which means that the thicknesses that we're having on the MTAs are already rather small compared to what you see on a wind turbine or a commercial transport airplane or something like that. And that, I believe, is evolution result of people trying out various things and finding out that relatively thin works sort of better. I stopped making MTAs for a couple of reasons together. I was, over a period of time, slowly losing inspiration with boomerangs. The main reason being I have never had anyone to throw with. I have always been the only one throwing. And at some point after, I do not know how many years, 15 years or something, that got a bit tedious. And so that made things slowly get less interesting. And I also saw that I was spending quite a bit of time making boomerangs and selling them. Which somehow turned into, I should not call it a business really, but it gave me a bit of
obligation.
It gave me a bit of obligation. There was also a bit of positive things with it, because it meant I was able to make boomerangs, which it turns out that the boomerangs that came out of my mold were not all the same. There's a bit of variability. And that was actually pretty interesting to follow, because it gave me the chance to try a little bit lighter boomerangs, a little bit more heavy boomerangs, boomerangs that had the center of gravity shifted a little bit in this direction, a little bit in that direction, and so on. So even making boomerangs for other people did have an element of experimentation to it, which I found interesting. But these things of boomerang making becoming more and more of a routine thing, at the same time as me being alone throwing, felt like it was going the wrong direction. And in the beginning of year 2000, I changed job, moved to Germany, and I was starting a job where I was expecting to work a lot. And I figured, all right, now I will not have the time. It's kind of good time to make a break in things. So that's where I sort of officially decided now I will stop making boomerangs. But there was not sort of no bad feelings or anything. It just felt like a good place to draw a line.
How many boomerangs in total you made?
Out of that mold, there are 360 something. I think there's 366 or 65 or something. I have a complete list of pretty much all the ones that I've made, and there's something like 360 ones that came out of the single mold, which I find from a manufacturing point of view astonishing. I was not expecting to get that many boomerangs out of that kind of simple mold without it being worn out one way or another, but it worked. I made boomerangs in periods, so I might have a week or two when I was making boomerangs quite a bit. Toward the end I had the process down to where I could actually make 2 a day. But then that was days when I could only do the lamination work. Then all the cutting and sanding and so on, that I would leave for other days. So that meant I might do a week or two of lamination work. Then I would sit with 10, 15 MTAs that needed to be the leading edges and trailing edges had to be sanded and cut and all this, and test flown and what I was using was what's it called in English? I think it is called fret saw or a copying saw. It's the kind of saw you would use to make a jigsaw puzzle. So it has a handle and a bow and a very thin blade and a rough cut by hand. When choosing the right blade, you can actually cut every downstroke. You actually cut between 1 and 2 centimeters.
Wow.
And it's possible with a little bit of practice and the way that the edges of my boomerangs were made to make the blade follow the edge of the boomerang. So I did not really have to, by eye, cut the correct... by aiming the blade a little bit out, but pushing it in sideways, I could actually rather quickly cut out the rough shape. Then there was wet sanding to get the edges nice, and trying to avoid getting splinters, and it's a nasty job. So it's, I mean that also contributed to why I was not that keen on continuing making the boomerang. The lamination work was kind of okay when I got the process down, but this whole thing of cutting edges and so on, it's not a fun job. Might be interesting also to, just as a funny little anecdote, I had a friend and colleague who worked as a thing maker. His speciality was to make things for industrial designers and artists and people who needed something made. Anything from a fake mobile telephone for Ericsson that would need the next mobile telephone generation. They needed a block that looked right, felt right, it did not need to work. But it needed to have all these properties. On the other extreme, artists designing a very fancy sculpture, needing someone to do the fiber composite stuff to make this sculpture actually happening in reality. So this guy was very well versed in fiber composites. At one point, when I was getting kind of desperate with the boomerang MTA making, I asked him, how about you and I make some kind of arrangement? Can you help me make these boomerangs? I have the connections where to sell them. or can we just split the manufacturing work or anything? And he asked, how much do you charge for these? And when I told him, he said, no way, no. Something like what today would be around 100 euros. I started off at about a third of that price or less, and the price was my only way of limiting the demand. And when I had a list of 20, 30 people, there was just no way of not doing something about it. And I had people waiting for 6 months to get their boomerangs, and yeah. The finish, I think, there are two questions related to finish. One is, how good finish does your mold have? So how shiny is your mold? And there I ended up using this aluminium master, which I was able to polish until it was absolutely mirror finish, which was one of the advantages of using aluminium. I have always had difficulties with painting and making painted stuff pretty. So trying to go for the aluminium was just a way of staying away from painting things. Then I used a gel coat in the mold, which can be polished on top. On the bottom side of the mold, I actually started off using a gel coat which cannot be polished on both sides. And then I damaged the top side. I had to grind that completely off and make it anew. And then, out of more or less a coincidence, I used a gel coat which can be polished, which meant when I got a little bit of damages or scratches or something, I could actually go in and polish up the mold again. So that way I was able to have a mold which was really, really nice from a finish point of view. The finish of the boomerangs themselves, there's that kind of comes down to trying to get rid of air bubbles. And getting rid of the air bubbles, there's again two parts of that. One is the part which is like on top of the main surface, and the other part is trying to get the fibers to follow the small radius and not make a not.
Yes.
If this is the mold, to have the fibers actually stay in there and not to do this. Yeah. And the small bubbles on the surface itself, I got rid of by using heat and timing. So I had a heated box where I kept the mold, and actually in the very beginning of working with heat, I was using my father's sauna. So I was standing in 50 degrees centigrade, 40 degrees centigrade, and actually doing the whole lamination process. But the idea being that I would mix my epoxy, I would let it sit so that air bubbles had time to rise. And it rises more fast if the epoxy is warm. Yeah. I would then use, I would then make sure that the molds were warm, between 40 and 50 degrees. I think I used 40 degrees in the beginning and 50 degrees later on. When I was working in my apartment, I had this box with a couple of light bulbs in it, and that kept my mold at around 50 degrees. And I would only take it out, put the epoxy in, and then put it back in. So I would typically get this warm mold out of the box. I would brush the mold with the epoxy, which had already had most of the bubbles disappear, because when I would mix the epoxy and put the epoxy pot in the box as well. So that would sit there for 4 or 5 minutes or something. As I brushed the epoxy on this 50 degree centigrade mold, the viscosity would just go very, very low, and most of the bubbles would just disappear. So I would brush on one part of the mold, then I would go to the other part, brush that one, which meant the first one got a little bit of time to sit and the bubbles disappeared. Then I would get the weave and put it down. And I would also wait, let's see, how did I do this? I would put the carbon fiber material into the mold, and then I would take a brush, which I would squeeze out all the epoxy from. And I would use this brush to push down the weave into the epoxy, so that I would have epoxy only going into the weave from the bottom, and the air would have a chance to escape upwards. So that's how I got rid of bubbles on the main surface. And the leading edges and corners and things where it's difficult to get the weave to stick, I had a rather crude way of dealing with. I would put all the weaves into the mold. I would put the mold back into the hot box, and then the weaves would not stay in the corners. It would actually rise off from the surface. And I had timed the curing process of the epoxy, so I knew that after I had done the lamination and put this thing in the box, if I waited, I think it was 45 minutes, and I went back and I had a wooden stick which was rounded in the end. I could, see, I'm not sure how to, I could take this stick and roll it along the edges and press down the weave into the corners. And at this point the epoxy would be it would be very plastic. It would make strings if I would draw it. I could turn the pot around and the mixing stick would not even fall out. Yes, I made a second mix for the micro balloons. Okay. So I made the shells like I described here and put them in the box. Then after 45 minutes I took the mold out. I pushed the weave into the corners, and then I put the filling in. And the filling was then a second mix of epoxy. Manuel was not. And at one point I met him in Switzerland at a competition, and we started talking a bit, and I asked him if there was a particular reason why he did not use my boomerangs, and he said, I cannot use them. They're too soft. When I throw them, they just go flop and do something, and it just didn't work. And he showed me throwing, and I fully understood. His throw was so strong, it just did not work. Manuel might fill you into this story because I might not be remembering it correctly, but I think I made a special boomerang for Manuel which was extra stiff in torsion. And I think he liked that one. At least it worked for him to throw. I don't know. Have fun. Try to find someone to throw with. And in general, and maybe this is outside of the target group, but for someone who gets into boomerangs without really having contact to the boomerang family, the boomerang community, get in touch with someone. Send an email to someone you find on the internet, find a result from a competition, try to look if there's someone in your area. Even if there's someone on the other side of the Atlantic, pop them an email. You are most likely going to get a very positive response, and that might really get you started and keep you going. That's how it worked for me. Without the support from, in particular at that time, the group of American throwers, I would not have gotten into boomerangs really.